right, welcome back, everybody. I'm actually a little emotional because the next speaker is somebody who made quite an impression on my life path and got me thinking about some fundamental questions that I didn't hold as fundamental. And I don't think there could be anybody better to deliver a conversational piece for questions of being and belonging that we often forget are pretty fundamental. So after about 3 years of withdrawing into the jungle, we've managed to lure him to Boom. Please welcome a person that also was instrumental in this whole program because he introduced Chiara to me and me to Chiara, and we put the program together for Liminal Village. So that coupling wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for him. So again, a special moment for us as well. Anyway, let's welcome Alnoor Ladha.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me well? In the back as well? Yeah? Yeah, back on this side. Okay. Yeah, pleasure to be here. Good to see you all. Thank you for coming out when you could be in Alchemy or Dance Temple. So today we're going to talk about ontology. How many people are familiar with this term, ontology? Okay, about a third. So ontology is the philosophy of being. It's how we see the world. And it's one of the core branches of philosophy. There's metaphysics, aesthetics, philosophy of science, ontology. It's one of the main 8 branches. And Chiara and the Boom team, Chiara's right here, changed the title to Holy Shift, which I have no idea what that means. And I don't want to impose any spiritual will on you. And I will let you define what holy is. But we were going to call it Onto Shift, because onto is just a short way to say ontology. I'll talk for like 30 minutes. I'm only going to show 3 slides, and I will apologize for PowerPoint. I know PowerPoint's embarrassing, but it might keep some awake. And then we'll do 30 minutes of Q&A, just discussion. And so if you have a question, if there's a word that I say that you want explanation, you could just put your hand up. And then if you have a question, we'll just wait to the end of the 30 minutes. Yeah, is that cool? And if you want me to slow down, you can also do the T. So I'm not going to talk about my background. I just think it's boring. And you know, we do all this work to transcend subject-object, and then we get into the credentializing who we are, and it's already this strange dynamic where I'm pretending to be a speaker and you're pretending to be an audience, and you know, all of that. So, but I will say I've spent maybe the last 20 years as an activist, organizer. I used to be a political strategist. I largely work with social movements, peasant movements, farmer movements, indigenous movements, largely in the global south. And so that informs my lens. And everything I'm going to say is my subjective opinion, right? And part of other ways of knowing and being in multiple simultaneous ontologies is to allow you to make your own decision. And then we can debate and discuss, and it's not personal because we're not identified with these points of view. They're just, we're wondering aloud. And we'll wonder aloud together. Also, some of what I'm going to talk about comes from a more structural, historical worldview. How many people were here for Erica's talk on the conspiracy of kings? Okay. So she also comes from an anarchist political philosophy, and also comes from the structural historical point of view. And what we mean by that is we're going to analyze the structure at whole and then break down its constitutive parts of how the global economic operating system works and how it affects our daily lives. And then the historical is understanding that there's historical antecedents and things that have happened that have brought us to this moment. The sort of modern ideology, the dominant culture, is very ahistorical. And so bringing in both the history and both the structure will inform the conversation. And we'll also be invoking a lot of like non-dualistic thinking. It's not optimism versus pessimism. It's both are simultaneously true. And it depends on your context, it depends on your disposition, it depends on your mood, it depends what archetypal role you want to play at the end of history. Okay, so we'll start a bit with the context. The dominant ideology that we live in can be described as neoliberalism. How many people are familiar with this term, neoliberalism? Okay, most of the room. That's great. There's a journalist for The Guardian who says, imagine being in a ration line in 1982 Russia, spending your entire day waiting for your daily bread, and you don't know the word communism. You don't know the ideology that put you in that position, that dictated your day, dictated what calories come into your body. And that's the level of ideological miseducation and ignorance that most of us hold, especially in the West. And this sort of period in time, this period in history, is often called the Anthropocene. And this is the theme of this year's boom. And anthros is human, scene is era. So it's the human era. It's the first time in the world's geological history of 4.4 billion years where a single species has colonized every aspect of the living world, affected every ecosystemic function, from water to air to rain to land usage to cultivating and slaughtering 60 billion to 100 billion animals a year for our own consumption. So there's no aspect of the world that has been left untouched. This is what we mean by the Anthropocene. And another way to think of the Anthropocene is it's the time where culture is faster than nature. Our culture is moving at such a speed that it's not in tune, it's not in symbiosis with the natural world. And it has also been described by Wendell Berry as this is the time where we are a species out of context. And so part of what we want to do is, how do we better understand the context in which we're in? How do we become more contextually sensitive in order to be more contextually relevant? In the Indian tradition, in the Vedic tradition, the pre-Hindu Vedas, they describe this period in history as the Kali Yuga. How many people are familiar with this term, the Kali Yuga? So in Vedic time, time is cyclical. And there's four major, they call them yugas within the greater yuga, cycles within the cycle. There's the Golden Age, the Satya Yuga, and then it denigrates into the Silver Age, then the Bronze Age, and then the Dark Ages, which is Kali Yuga, which is now. And many mystical traditions sort of converge on this insight. The Buddhists call this the age of degeneration. The Iroquois have the seventh fire prophecy. The Hopi have the sixth sun prophecy. And it all basically says the same thing. There will be a time where human beings destroy their natural habitat, where there's violence, war, pillage, rape, patriarchy, systemic racism. And this will be the moment where the fork in the road happens. This will be the moment where we as a species decide to become something else or destroy not only our way of living, but also hundreds of, if not thousands of species in the more than human world. So neoliberalism is just the dominant ideology of the Anthropocene. And it's a form of capitalism. It's basically a brand of capitalism, you can say, or you could think of it as the historical heir of the legacy of proto-capitalism, traditional capitalism, industrial capitalism, technological capitalism. It's all sort of meshed to this moment where there's a very strong ideology that is essentially pro-corporate, extraction-based, greed-based, and we can say that that system is outside of us, but it affects every aspect of our lives. Every single aspect of our lives is mediated by capital in some form. We used to have many ways to acquire goods and services: hunting, bartering, gifting, trading, and now we have predominantly one, which is debt-based capital. And how debt-based capital works, in some ways, is very simple. Money is printed at debt at 1%. That money is then lent out at 2%. They call it prime. And then the global economy has to grow at 3% in order for that money to be valuable. It's essentially a Ponzi scheme. It's a house of cards. So you have to grow the global economy every year by 3%. And so that doesn't sound like a lot, but it means a doubling of the global economy every 20 years. So every 20 years, twice as many Big Macs and iPhones and Toyota Priuses, exploitation of human labor, all of that has to be doubled. And it's the first time economists and ecologists have agreed that there will not be another doubling of the global economy. It's physically impossible. We've hit 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries. There's 200 species going extinct every day. We have peak levels of inequality. We're dwindling in resources. Even this idea of the emerging economies, going to places like Southeast Asia and the African continent and Latin America, these are all attempts to continue the growth machine, even though there's less and less available. So we have a sort of upper bound of maybe 20 years at best left of the Western way of living. And that's the context we're in. There's a famous political philosopher named Antonio Gramsci. And he had this line to describe modernity. He said, "We are prisoners of context in the absence of meaning." We are prisoners of context in the absence of meaning. The context is so all-pervasive, right? Where we grow up, who our neighbors are, who our friends are, what job opportunities we have, what educational opportunities we have. They're predetermined by a historical system in which Western Europeans invented debt-based capital 500 years ago, about the same time as imperialism and colonialism, and then went around the world and imposed that way. And so when we say capitalism is a form of white supremacy, we're not saying all white people are supremacists. It's just that there's an institutional structural head start that is based on a form of white supremacy. When we say that capitalism is a form of patriarchy, it doesn't mean all men are patriarchs. It means that what capitalism has done is it's prejudiced the work of male bodies and subjugated the work of female bodies. So a high-velocity trader in Wall Street gets paid $300,000, and essential care workers get paid minimum wage. And that's the structure of the system. It's organized in this way. So when people, especially economists, talk a lot about externalities, you've probably heard this term, externality. It's like an unintended side effect of a system that's working. That's their defense. But 93 cents of every dollar end up in the hands of the top 1%. So by definition, capitalism creates inequality, and capitalism creates poverty. Every dollar of wealth created heats up our planet because we have a fossil fuel extractives-based system. So by definition, capitalism creates climate change and ecological collapse. These things cannot be separate. And importantly, the colonization of capitalist modernity lives in our bodies. It's an embodied ideology, an embodied theology, an embodied cosmology. It doesn't matter how far off the grid we think we are, or how anti-capitalist we are. You know, my clothes are made in sweatshops. I use fossil fuels to drive around. There's no one who's not enmeshed in the neoliberal system right now. Yeah, maybe an indigenous community that's out of contact, but by and large, the globalized system has enmeshed all of us in this life-destroying machine. Okay. Okay, so here's one way to think about neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is a complex, adaptive, evolutionary system. Like a bioregion, like an ecosystem, like the Earth is, it's alive. It has a set of rules that are generative. Money's printed at debt, that debt needs to grow. There's a sort of, you could call it like a distributed fascism, where we're not trying to enact the dominant culture, but we have no option except to go to work, make money, consume, buy on Amazon.com, all of that shit, right? And so the nature of a complex adaptive system is to pull the aspects of the system that serve its logic to the top. So we think that there's a merit system, right? You work hard, you go to the right schools, you get the right job, you're somehow going to be rewarded by the system. But the opposite is true. The system rewards those who best serve its logic. It pulls them to the top. The more short-termist, greedy, psychotic, sociopathic you are, the better you will do within the dominant system. And we all feel this on some level. Our rebellion to, not engage is part of that. And yet, non-dualistically, we are enmeshed in it and have to take it seriously and put food on the table and pay the bills and whatnot. So think of it as a complex adaptive system, so it's alive. And like all living things, it's organized around fractals, right? We are fractal manifestations of the culture and the context in which we are embedded. There is no individual person outside the relational web of interaction amongst all of us, where we live, where we get our food from, where our waste goes, where our electricity comes from. It's completely interconnected, although we are disconnected and more mediated from the sources of where these things come from. So this is our way to see that, which is you have this very dominant hegemonic culture. It's a theology. And it says things like, if everyone pursues their own selfish interest, somehow an equilibrium will be created. The invisible hand of God, of the market, will create this. If you're poor, it's because you're lazy or stupid, not because you didn't have the 500-year head start or you're willing to be a psychopath. And so there's a very dominant ideology that hits every major point of where our lives come from. I say theology because it's more akin to a religion. Why we're here, where we're going, it's the live, work, consume, die paradigm. And so that's the dominant culture. And then we have these sectors. So you'll have finance and technology and social movements and art and big pharma, and we all think that these sectors are somehow have agency. They're have a purpose beyond serving the logic of the operating system, but they're just simply subsets of that operating system. So a lot of utopian thought is like, well, science is going to save us. Technology is going to save us. But these things are subsets of the neoliberal culture, right? We take academia, for example. Who decides on the research? Where does the funding come from? Where were the people educated? What are their ontological views that they're importing into with biases and all of that? So there's no such thing as science outside of capitalism. There's no such thing as technology outside of capitalism. There's no silver bullet for where we're going or what we're doing. It's a derivative subset of that culture. And then you have the next one, which is institutions. Whether that's a private entrepreneur or a major corporation, there's this belief that, okay, well, there's more agency as we go down this pyramid, right? Organizations can do what they want, and yet they all have the imperative for growth, even if they're not for profit. They're job creation machines, and that's their role. They're fractal nodes that uphold the logic of their sector, which upholds the logic of the neoliberal system. And then we come to the individuals. And there's this belief, well, individuals can change the world. All we need to do is work on ourselves and be embodied, and et cetera, et cetera. And the truth is that we are all colonized. Mind, body, soul, heart complex is colonized by belief systems of separation, of dominance, of rationalism, right? And we'll get a bit into what's dominant culture versus what are some of the emerging onto-shifts, what are some of the new ancient emerging ways of knowing and being and sensing. So that's essentially this concept. I'm going to skip that. And I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by ontological shift. So the dominant culture can be characterized as materialist, positivist, rationalist. So what does that mean? It's materialist in the sense that from the scientific revolution on, we believe that the peak of knowledge and wisdom is scientific rationality. Now we can reduce the entire world to the atom, and then the atom to the proton and the neutron and the electron, and now we understand the universe. Okay, we have the complexity of quantum physics, and now we will break that down to the quark and the various subatomic particles, and now we understand the universe. And so it's that worldview that we've all been socialized in completely affects the way I see the world, right? I see this wooden lectern, and the way my neurological patterning is ordered is I see it as a separate thing that I have the right and entitlement to move about as I wish. It has no animate characteristics. It is dead, inert matter that I have the right to manipulate, right? That's in my worldview. That's ontologically hardwired into me. And of course, there's indigenous cultures and mystical traditions that would treat this as kin, as a sibling. They would understand that this wood has come from a place. They would probably know where that place is. They would have a relationship with the land. They probably would have built their object, and they're in interactive relationality, in participation with the beingness of that thing. And that's a different ontology. So that's what the materialist aspect does. And then the rational aspect is the hubris that I can even understand this with my own mind. That the thought patterning that I create can reduce and synthesize this in a way that human beings can understand. And not only do we have the right to understand that, our eventual goal of progress is to understand everything. And that arrogance and that hubris is rooted in the idea of rationalism. And then positivism is the kind of base of scientific thought, which is that we not only can understand it, we can prove we can understand it, and we can show other people the right way to see this object or chemical compound or whatever, right? And that's the dominant culture. And so the economics of this and the science of it and the spiritual implications, these are not separate. These are completely enmeshed and entangled. Because if your heart, body, mind, soul complex is colonized, your spiritual body is colonized, your mind is colonized. And I'm not saying this in either good or bad. I'm saying it as, let's be contextually sensitive to that colonization so we can be contextually relevant in the time of the Anthropocene, in the Kali Yuga. Okay, last slide, and then you don't need to read this. There's lots of words on the, and I won't do them all, but just to give you a sense of some of the ontological shifts that are happening. So I just finished a research project for a book we've been writing around post-capitalism. And we interviewed 100 practitioners, activists, funders, indigenous elders, cosmologists, scientists, researchers, to sort of see where the kind of edge thinking, the liminal thinking, the post-capitalist logic. And post-capitalism is not another ism to replace capitalism. It's just shared values and ideology around generosity, altruism, solidarity, gift, reciprocity, relationality. And who's doing the most interesting work, how long has it been happening? And so some of the kind of dominant tropes came out in this research, and I'll just share them as a starting place for dialogue. So the first is what we talked about with rational logic as the core, the pinnacle of thought. And there's this move to translogic, to not say that rational thought is bad or good, but it's one way to dissect and understand the world that does not have privilege over other ways of seeing, sensing, understanding, being in the world. So our intuition is as relevant. Praying on a tobacco pipe is as relevant. Being in animate dialogue with a tree is as relevant than any insight we can get from books or reductionism. Then there's this move from monoculture to polyculture. So we can characterize the dominant culture as a monoculture. Monoculture of the mind, monoculture of our food. If capitalism had its way, if we just let this, the sort of momentum of this thing go, we'd all be wearing Nike shoes with Apple computers and Microsoft software, listening to Beyonce or whatever the fuck corporate capitalism wants us to listen to at the moment. And that's the trajectory of it, right? Consolidation of power, efficiencies, buying out politicians. There's research that came out of Harvard a couple of years ago from Lawrence Lessig, who's a constitutional lawyer, and he found that for every dollar invested in lobbying Congress in the US, there was a $220 return on investment. So if you're a corporation, it makes sense to essentially buy politicians, hijack the democratic process. The role of globalization is to find the cheapest places where you can exploit human labor and land. So wherever there's lower environmental regulations, which they will impose through the World Bank and the IMF and others. And so the antidote to monoculture is polyculture. Many ways of knowing, many ways of being, many ways of sensing, many tongues. The privilege of multiple simultaneous ontologies as opposed to one monolithic worldview. We talked already about separation, materialism, positivism. What I didn't say is my ontological perception of this from how I've been socialized in the Western thought is that this is separate to me. And that deep ontology, you can practice your way out of it, but it's not like a turnkey. Like most of us have not grown up in intact cultures worthy of the name culture, where there's elders, where there's ritual, where there's ceremony, where there's an understanding, there's a ancestral line of wisdom keepers that experimented at the edge of consciousness and then brought this knowledge, right? Most of us are spiritual orphans in the West and in dominant culture. And so part of the Ontological Shift work is practice, by any means necessary. Psychedelics, tantra, dance, whatever. There's infinite ways in. I come from an anarchist political philosophy, and I come from a mystic Sufi path in my lineage. And so I'm not in the business of telling people how to go about doing this. But I would say any means necessary. And there is a sense of urgency in it, and yet non-dualistically, time is non-linear and cyclical, and so all of these things need to be taken consideration in your own practice. And part of what we're moving to is this kind of non-dual, animistic queering of categories and understanding and gender and all of the traditional constructs that have been forced upon us. And there's a sort of I call it like a quantum ethic. And what quantum ethic is about is there's no golden rule or categorical imperative. Our ethics don't come from what institutions and power elites decree is important. That the ontology is not separate from the epistemology, from how we know things. Epistemology is the philosophy of knowledge. Why do we think we know what we know? And the way we see the world is deeply enmeshed with the way we think we understand the world is deeply enmeshed with our ethics. And there's an amazing post-humanist philosopher named Karen Barad who wrote a book I highly recommend called Meeting the Universe Halfway. And she was a quantum physicist and then became a philosopher. And she talks a lot about onto-ethico-epistemology. That these things are so deeply connected that the reductionist scientific worldview and the world of philosophy that separates all of these things is part of the problem. And part of this work is the move from unquestioned orthodoxy to taking self and collective responsibility for having a point of view on the first principles. First principles of why we're here, where we're going, what's our role as our species, what's my personal karma and dharma, what's the ancestral redemption work that wants to happen through my body? Why did I incarnate in a male body or a female body or a non-binary body or a black body or a white body or etc.? That these are omens that when we're in the animistic dialogue with the living world and the living cosmos, that they get revealed to us in that participatory, self-reflexive process. And I'll skip some of these. But I'll talk a little bit about entitlement versus entrustment. There's a great Sufi proverb, and it says, "You are entrusted with everything and entitled to nothing." You are entrusted with everything, and you are entitled to nothing. And it's often attributed to the Great Mother to her children. So she's like, I've given you this bounty. You have incarnation. You have community. You have access to food and water for now. And you're not entitled to it, but it's a gift that's entrusted upon you. And that level of humility and reverence and wonder and approaching in that way shifts the outcomes of what is possible. Like, collapse is the highest probable outcome right now, but it's not guaranteed. And what ontology is teaching us is the manner by which we approach is more important than the content of what we're approaching or what we think we're doing. So the manner in which we approach, the manner in which we see the world, our tenderness with this call and response. And then last slide, and I'm going to open it up for discussion, is this is just a way to think about spiral logic, which is another way to say translogic, which is, firstly, it's not linear, it's not an arrow, it's not progress in the traditional Western sense. It's multi-directional, it's reflexive, so it learns from the participation. It's discursive in the sense that it builds momentum upon itself. It's non-linear. It's not A, then B, then C. You come in and out of the spiral in different ways at different moments in your life. And it's completely interdependent and interconnected. And so at the center of the spiral is cosmology, is this idea of first principles. It's like, our traditional practices of sitting in contemplation with the major questions were usurped by the church, by media, by government, by power elites who then imposed on us, this is what's going to happen when you die. These are the points of reference. You're born, you're have to have a job in this certain career, you're bar mitzvah, all of that sort of like cultural weight, which has its role. But there's also part of our role as citizens of our times, which is to take the self-responsibility of sitting in contemplation with those questions as a spiritual political praxis. And then we come out and we say, okay, well, this is a never-ending process to better understand the cosmology, to better understand why we think we know what we know. And then to shift our understanding of us as individuals to webs of relational entanglements. That there can be no individual in a relational world, like on every level, right? Our stomach has 100 billion bacteria in it. We are completely colonized by other beings at a physical level, at the first brain in the stomach. We hold all sorts of parasites in our biome. We have ancestors that are speaking through us. We are the culmination. We are the heir of our ancestors' legacies. And so all of these beings, and the beings that we're on a 3D plane, materially, relationally connected with, make up this sort of web of relational entanglements. And then our way to see how those webs of relational entanglements come together are in social ecologies. Social movements, they could be sectors, places you work, communities, but to rethink them not as places I go as an individual, but social ecologies that I'm embedded in a fractal, organic way. And then we get to the superstructure, which right now is neoliberal capitalism. The rules that are generative, that affect our daily lives, affect what we eat, how we spend our leisure time, if we have leisure time, all of that. And rethinking the operating system to be more of a biome, a bioregional based localized economy, localized communities where we are outside of the dominant culture. More and more of these projects, these sort of cultural crystals are emerging. And they're necessary for the transformation that's going to happen and is already happening. And then the next is then finding our role in the broader planetary ecology, what we call the Gaian entelechy. Enteleki is a Greek word that means within it, it has its own purpose. It has its own agency. So the Gaian whole, this being that we are embedded within and children of and evolutionary byproducts of, has its own agency. It has its own point of view. It has its own evolutionary path. It has its own karma and its own dharma, and how to honor that and integrate with that and be in the dialogue with that. And then the last is understanding the Gaian role within a broader, expanding, emergent universe, which LSD is very helpful for, and psychedelics are very helpful for. But as a spiritual political praxis, to understand that role. And none of these are, you will answer them once. This is why it's a spiral. It's participatory, it's self-reinforcing, it's ongoing work. And if we spent as much time as we did on contemplating some of these questions that we do in self-help workshops or whatever, there would already be a revolution. But most of us are taught that these questions have been answered, and part of our role is to just plug in to where we can most benefit from the existing structure. And so we become complicit in the destruction of the planet, in the destruction of ancient ways of being, and the whole cycle. So I'm gonna stop there, so we have enough time for questions. But also would love for you to just track your body and do a little embodied cognition work on, as I bring these things up, what comes up for you? Where's there uncomfortableness? Where do you feel complicit? Where do you feel judged? Where do you feel like, who the fuck is this guy telling me ideas that I don't necessarily agree with? And you don't need to agree with them. The role is not persuasion. It's to put into the center of, how do we fully participate in a world that we did not fully create? And that is a collective sense-making process. That's not something that can be decided necessarily on your own. That happens in dialogue, it happens in discussion, it happens in discourse. So I'm going to stop there, and we'll do questions. I don't know how you want to do questions. Pass the mic.
I just had my personal reaction with actually this slide. Is the interaction of the environment here and the entanglement of the environment here, from when the music is marrying the words, it goes from dystopian perception of what's being said to a now-topian, more optimistic version, and it's the same track pumping, and I'm just experiencing all of the content completely differently. So woohoo for highly curated environments for this to happen. And the other thing is, there's always a quote here or there, maybe once a year, maybe every few years, that sticks with you. And there's one that Alnoor imparted on me that stuck with me, that I just remembered, and has been like a little guiding mantra, from Terence McKenna, when Terence said, "You know who the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse are? The 4 real horsemen? Monoculture, monotheism, monogamy, and monotony." And that's really stuck with me. So I'm opening it up for questions.
Hello. If we're in the age of mud, let's say, closer, do you have a practical way to prepare in the coming 20 years to at least try to push the coming time in the right direction?
Do you want to take a few, or I just go one at a time?
I'll take a couple.
No, I can start with that while you're, just to go back to say, as a mystic and as an anarchist, I don't like to impose solutions on people, and I don't think solutions are necessarily the answer. I think solutionism is what has got us into this mess in the first place. And every new technological innovation comes with this cascade of consequences we have no idea about, right? Like Marshall McLuhan used to talk about the automobile. And we thought we were inventing this automobile, but it gave birth to suburbs and the rise of fossil fuels and teenage pregnancies because they were using their cars as a bedroom. But, you know, good things, bad things, all of that. And what I'd say is, one of the first things I try to do is to be a good student of my culture. And my culture, for good or ill, is the dominant culture of Euro-American Western corporate capitalism. I call it capitalist modernity. And so to be a good student of the culture means to understand the impoverishments of your culture and the impoverishments that we are imposing on others through development, through technological innovation, etc. And then the second part of being a good student of your culture is to disassociate from the dominant culture, right? To understand power, you need to understand culture. To understand culture, you have to disassociate from the culture, right? You have to get to these boundary dissolving spaces to see the level and depth of the programming and the conditioning and the colonization. The third is this idea of the political spiritual praxis, that there is no separation from how we ethically move in the world, what our beliefs are about the world, and how we go about spending our day. And you know, surviving or even benefiting from a rigged game that ensures the destruction of the living world and other species in the more than human world is not something I want to participate in. And so I try to be a conscientious objector in any way I can. I left New York to move to Costa Rica. I live in a community where we grow our own food. I think food self-sovereignty and land self-sovereignty are going to be critical. I think climate change is going to force us to live in small autonomous communities. You know, we're talking, if we look at the last IPCC report, the International Panel on Climate Change, this Code Red report, basically every feedback loop that they had imagined even 5 years ago is accelerating, right? We're talking 3-degree rise in temperature by 2050, which is correlated with 40% biodiversity loss. So 40% of all living things will die, and a 10 to 20 meter sea level rise. Like fundamentally, the way we are going to engage in the world is going to be completely different. But the human mind is, psychologists call it temporal myopia. Temporal being time and myopia being like narrow-mindedness, where our evolutionary biology was not set up to understand cascading collapses, discontinuous change on that level. And so this comes back to non-dualistic thought as well. And the practice of emergence is understanding the world that is coming and preparing for it, but also not being in a dystopic, depressed paralysis about it. Is to be in the appreciation of having incarnated in the Kali Yuga at this time, and knowing that that was a choice on a soul level to be here in the dark ages of humanity. And those are just some of the practices, and there's more, and we can talk, and I'll stay here for another like 20 minutes after the talk is over if you want to chat.
First of all, thank you so much. It's enlightening. So how do we actually go back to our homes, live in our neighborhoods, doing this shift where there's all kinds of cultures? How do we avoid the culture clash? I mean, Harold Innis, who was a student of Marshall McLuhan, spoke about the age of between ages, the war of ages, as information crosses distance in a shorter period. Then our age is sitting right here. We're all doing the shift, but we go back and we go back to our families, our cities. How do we avoid the clash? Or how do you see the problem?
Like, there's many schools of thought on this, right? There's the traditional kind of New Age spiritualist worldview, which is you just work on yourself and you do embodiment, and then the world is going to change. And I think that's spiritual bypassing. And then there's the, let's say, the Marxist superstructural point of view, right? That we need to change the rules of the operating system at their core because they're generative and they affect every aspect of our lives. And I come at this from a more of a non-dualistic approach. I think simultaneously we need to do the individual work, the embodiment work, that there isn't a process that we achieve some sense of enlightenment and then we can go engage with the world. The actual act of engaging in the world, in solidarity and in service, builds our spiritual practice. And then we also have to organize at a local level. In the places we live, at a community level, it could be dyads, triads, larger groups of people, but to have, to find the others, as McKenna would say. And then, of course, we have the superstructural level, which we also have to address. We have to find a way to stop the global supply chain of goods and services, right? Capitalism is creating climate change, it's creating inequality, it's creating poverty. There isn't a social issue happening in this meta-crisis. Meta-crisis is these interlocking crises of climate, ecology, economy, etc. That's not directly related to the operating system. You can bring up any issue that's happening in the world, COVID, okay? Well, COVID is not just biological warfare or whatever you believe. Zoologists and epidemiologists are saying that there's going to be a 10 times increase in zoonotic viruses like COVID in the next 10 to 15 years because we're encroaching on the natural world. And species that are not supposed to mingle, not supposed to interact with humans in that way, landscapes are destroyed, ecosystems are destroyed, bioregions are destroyed. And so we're in the warm-up phase. We thought COVID was an uncomfortable couple of years. These cascading collapses are going to increase. And so attuning ourselves to that work while simultaneously building the spiritual body and the physical body and the inner community and outer resilience that's required to face full shadow and full light. Because yes, we can understand the climate change, and also immense amounts of beauty are happening at the same time, right? It's a bifurcation. And in times of bifurcation, when there's extreme light and extreme dark, there's going to be a breaking point at some point. And part of our work is to choose what archetypal role we want to play in that. Do we want to be the guy driving the Jaguar and being an investment banker on Wall Street as history crumbles upon itself, as we enter this age of consequence, where 5,000 years of pillage and rape and destruction and patriarchy and racism are coming to the fore? Or do we want a different cosmic drama to unfold for our incarnation and the incarnation of those around us? And that on one level is a self-choice, and it's also not, because you will be relationally shaped by the context in which you're embedded.
If you were a cult leader, I would so be into it.
Where is it?
Hey. So I really resonated with what you said about the manner in which we approach some of these questions, these challenges, these issues being more important than the content of them. I'm not sure if I've taken that slightly out of context, but more or less. I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit on what you think could be, what you think is a helpful, what you think is a useful manner of approach for these things.
For me, I start with the ontology. I'm trying to be in constant examination of why I see the world the way I see the world, and to try to shatter the illusion of separation through whatever means work for you. Meditation, psychedelics, tantra, dance, breathwork. And that's why I call it praxis, right? Praxis is ongoing theory being refined for an ongoing practice, which then discursively shifts and changes the theory. And so the manner in which we approach, when we're doing it with reverence and with wonder, and in this animistic dialogue, as opposed to with our certainty, with our sense of entitlement, with our victimhood, right? These thought forms are embodied within our physical soma. And they play out neural patterns and psychological patterns and physical patterns all of the time. And so that decolonization work is central to the shift in ontology. And like I said, it's not a turning of a key, it's a practice, right? To see all living things as kin, and to be in relationality and reciprocity with the living cosmos, and holding non-dualistically the insignificance of our existence on one level, and the fact that God is becoming self-aware through us simultaneously. that's not an easy practice, especially in the distraction of capitalist modernity. And it becomes easier. The more we disidentify with the culture, like if any part of me wants what the dominant culture is selling on tap, Wikipedia pages, cult fellowship, money, power, etc., I'm already fucked. Because now I'm going to be a servant of what the dominant culture offers, which is those things. And so the practice is never ending. And it's also the commitment to transcending subject-object. I was talking to Chiara earlier in the back, and we were saying, like, one of my lines of discernment is, like, I only want to spend time with people who are committed to transcending subject-object, to transcending the idea of themselves. Not in some belittling way, and not permanently, and not, of course we need to function, and we have to show our passport and play these identities and these roles, but as the primary focus of the spiritual path. And if we look at indigenous traditions and mystical traditions, this was their goal, right? Like the aim of the Sufi dervish dance is to blur the line between where you begin and stop and the world begins and stops, because it's already blurry, it's already queered, it's already messy, but our ontological lens is prohibiting us from interacting in that way.
Hi. Hello.
Hello.
I think what you're saying is really interesting. I'm currently writing my own master's thesis, actually, on non-dual ontology, and especially how it relates to the neurosciences. And within the neurosciences, you already have, maybe you've heard of it, you already have kind of a pocket of researchers that are approaching the brain from this angle, from non-dualism, from embodied cognition. So a lot of what you say connects with that. And I agree with what you're saying, that really fundamentally it's a shift in ontology, so it's a shift in how we perceive our relation to our surroundings, and it's not something abstract, right? It's really a change in how we experience others in our world, how we experience things in our world, etc. So just to wrap it up, I actually don't have any question for you. I just wanted to make a short connection here, and I would love to discuss this a bit more with you later on, if you would be open to that.
Yeah, of course, thank you.
Awesome.
I'll tell you a line that ayahuasca told me in a ceremony. And of course, she was using language she knew I would like, so there's always the subjective entanglement. But she said, if you don't have a critique of capitalist modernity, you are contextually irrelevant. But if all you have is a critique of capitalist modernity, you are spiritually and creatively impoverished. So you need to understand the structure of the system and what it's doing to you and what it's doing to the living world, and it cannot stop there. And this was the old divide between the left and New Age people, right? Historical dialectalism and materialism and Marxism and even anarchism was deeply understanding the structure, this historical structural worldview. And the spiritual communities, I think of like the spiritualist movement in the US in the 1800s, for example, were building new embodied cultures. They were building their farms, and the Quakers were doing their thing. And this is why I say sort of spirituality and politics are the same impulse, because anarchism and mysticism are the same impulse. Anarchism is no gods, no masters. That the role of government should be to localize power at the decision-making level of where we live and how we want to live our lives. And mysticism is also no gods, no masters, no mullahs, no popes, no imams, no rabbis. That our relationship with the divine is direct, it's Gnostic, it's unfolding, it's happening through us. Allah is becoming self-aware through its consciousness of us. It is not a static being. That, there's this old Ram Dass line. The universe is perfect, including my desire to change it. The universe is perfect, including my desire to change it. That evolution is not happening outside of us. That it is a co-creative, co-facilitated process of consciousness becoming self-conscious in a fractally distributed way.
Hey brother, good to see you. So, I came a little bit late into the talk. From the end I've been in here, but I know what you guys are doing in Brave Earth in Costa Rica, and Yeah, myself, I left like Germany 13 years ago and moved to more Costa Rica and Colombia. I very connected to ancestral lineages in Colombia, where like the heart of the earth and prayers are reactivating to, like, in my somewhere in my vision, I have a more positive outcome that you have in this apocalypse, because I myself see a lot of solutions in what you are already applying in Brave Earth. I'm like loving this space. It's so amazing. Like, if you guys go to Costa Rica, you can see this amazing village they created in such a short time. And I just want to ask you for like because it sounds sometimes very negative, because I'm also seeing like a very negative outcome, but can you see also a very positive availability of change faster, and give a vision on that? There's like, I see when I come to Europe, I live in the jungle in a small house, you know, like it's a different way of life, taking care of your own water. Like, I see the solution in finding more individual change and learning how to build villages again, learning how to make decisions together, to take care of a fire, to sing, to dance, to go deeper into so many things. But there's so much resources I see right now, so much NFT and bitcoins and blah blah blah. And how can we apply that practically to change? To like, how can we connect in a better way?
Okay, so I don't see myself as apocalyptic. I see the practice that I'm doing as sort of non-dual, like full shadow, full light. And we're not used to it in our culture, because we live in a culture of what personal benefit do I get from this knowledge, and certainty and entitlement. And so I don't feel entitled to be optimistic. And I also feel that optimism is inherently hostile to the present moment, as is pessimism. And so, are there alternatives? Are there solutions? Of course. Are they informed by the dominant culture? Also, of course, on one level, even if they're in reaction to. The scale at which neoliberal power is accumulating and amalgamating is hundreds of magnitudes stronger right now than the scale of alternatives. And that may change. And the probability is that we move to high-level collapse, species extinction, etc. That's just the probability. And I don't necessarily believe in probability. I also believe that the Gain Enteleki has her own point of view, and that miracles can happen, and that she will intervene in a way that is appropriate to the evolution of consciousness. And I also, to add a layer to it, is like, the species that comes from human beings 1 billion years from now will be as different to us as we are from single-cell amoebas. We have no idea where evolution is going to take us. I'm also not entitled to my certainty, because that would take away the mystery and the romantic act of incarnation. I have no fucking idea. These are subjective ideas that I'm wondering aloud with, let's say. And then there's also this other layer of complexity, and Malka and I were having this conversation a couple of nights ago, and Akira, was that 99.9% of every species that's ever existed is now extinct on this planet in the 4.4 billion years of the Earth, 2 billion years of life. All life, all 60 million species that are on this planet right now, represent 0.01% of all life that's ever existed. So maybe the purpose of human evolution is not to continue in perpetuity and go to Mars and colonize the solar system. And maybe what we're being taught is how to die well. How to die well at a grand scale, at a species level scale, to be Buddha when the hurricanes and the wildfires and the tornadoes are coming, and to understand reincarnation deeply at that moment, right? Because how we die in many ways is more important than how we live. It's the culmination of all of our life lessons at the moment we think matters the most. And I'm not even saying that's true. I'm just suggesting it as a possibility to get outside of this binary of optimism versus pessimism. And the more we really study, research the full shadow of what's happening right now, and not in a conspiracy theory way, not like It's not even about individual people. This is the logic of a complex adaptive system. It's a Frankenstein, right? All these techno-utopians are waiting for singularity, and we're already in singularity. Capitalism, neoliberalism is the greatest artificial intelligence we've already created, and it's here. And it dominates every aspect of our lives. And crypto and Bitcoin and pharmacological innovations, these are all subsets of that system. These are not outside of the system. These are just the logical outcomes of a system trying to survive by any means necessary. And hope is one of its opiums.
Or otherwise known as hopium. We're out of stage time, but there will be some space for continued smaller group conversation. Yeah, that's some sort of sonic expression of whatever vibe we're at.
Excuse me.